Bedtime Reading. The Call of the Wild. Chapter 1. An Introduction to the Primitive. Buck did not read newspapers. If he did, he would have known that soon there would be trouble, not only for himself, but also for every able and good dog from Puget Sound to San Diego. Men exploring in the Arctic lands had discovered gold up in the north. Boat and train companies were taking thousands of men to the Northland. Dogs were needed for transportation, especially big dogs with heavy coats to protect them from the cold. Buck lived at a big house called Judge Miller's place in the sunny valley of Santa Clara. The house was far away from the road, hidden by trees. The path to the house ran through large trees and grassy areas. The back area of the house was even larger. There were big stables for horses, servants' houses, and even some fruit trees. There was also a swimming pool that Judge Miller's boys often visited to cool off from the afternoon heat. It was over this huge area that Buck ruled. He was born here and had already lived here for 4 years. True, there were other dogs, but they did not count, often coming and going, or barely going outside of the house. Buck was not a house dog or a racing dog. He joined the boys in their swimming and went hunting with them. Often he looked after the judge's 2 daughters, Molly and Alice, when they went out for nightly walks. On winter nights, he would lie at the judge's feet beside a warm fire. He also carried the judge's grandsons on his back, guarding their every footstep. He totally ignored the other dogs, especially Toots and Isabel, 2 small, foreign-looking dogs that only stayed inside. Yes, Buck was king, and he ruled over all the land and creatures of Judge Miller's place. His father, Elmo, was a huge dog, and he had been Judge Miller's constant companion. Buck wasn't as large. His mother, Sleep, was a smaller type of dog from Scotland, so his weight was only 140 pounds. Nevertheless, his weight gave him an air like a king, and he had developed a lot of pride in himself, much like a country gentleman does with a life of respect and good living. Luckily, he did not grow lazy and become a house dog. Rather, his love of hunting and outdoor fun hardened his muscles and stopped him from becoming fat. Such was the manner of Dog Buck in the fall of 1897, when the Klondike strike dragged men from all over the world to the frozen north. But newspapers and the way of the world were unknown to Buck. Judge Miller had a helper in their garden by the name of Manuel. Manuel had a certain weakness for a gambling game called lottery. Unfortunately, he was always losing, and because he didn't earn a lot of money as a helper, he was often in debt. One night, while the judge was away at a meeting and the boys away at an athletic club, Manuel took Buck to the fruit garden. Buck didn't know why he was out with Manuel, and only imagined it was for a walk. Only one man saw them arrive at a little station known as College Park. This man talked with Manuel, and money was exchanged between them. "You might have tied up his mouth before you delivered him," complained the stranger. This made Manuel tie another piece of rope around Buck's neck. "Twist this, and he won't be able to breathe," said Manuel. Buck had accepted Manuel's rope around his neck, but when the stranger grabbed hold of it, he started to growl. To his surprise, the rope tightened around his neck, shutting off his breath. In quick anger, Buck jumped at the man, but the man closed his hands around Buck's neck and threw him over on his back. Then the rope tightened again, and Buck, in his anger, could hardly breathe. He had never been so badly treated, nor had he ever been so angry. Although he struggled against the man, he soon lost his strength and did not remember being thrown into the luggage car of the train. The next thing Buck knew, he was inside a luggage car of a train. He had heard the high sound of the train's whistle and had been on enough train rides with the judge to know where he was. He opened his eyes and looked about with great anger, like a king who has been kidnapped. The man beside him tried to grab the rope around his throat again, but Buck was too fast. He bit the man on the hand, and he did not let go until he had his senses choked out of him again. "Yes, this one has fits of anger at times," the man said, hiding his bloody hand away from a train clerk who had arrived to see about the sounds of fighting in the car. Trying to sound calm, he said, "I'm taking this dog up to San Francisco on the boss's orders. He says there's a man there who can train and cure this dog." He led Buck to the back of a bar that was near the San Francisco waterfront. In a small room, he complained to the barkeeper. "All I get is $50 for this? And I wouldn't do it again if you paid me $1,000, he said. His hand was wrapped in a bloody handkerchief, and his right pant leg was ripped from knee to ankle. "How much did the other fellow get?" the barkeeper demanded. "100, was the reply. "I wouldn't do it for a cent less." "That makes 150, calculated the barkeeper. "He'd better be worth it, or I'm a fool." The kidnapper undid his bandages and looked at his wounded hand. "I hope I don't get a disease from this," he added. "If you do, it'll be because you deserve it," laughed the barkeeper. "Here, give me a hand with him." Buck tried to face his kidnappers, but he was suffering from too much pain. His throat and tongue hurt terribly, and he felt that half of his life had been choked out of him. He was repeatedly choked and thrown down while they cut off his heavy metal collar from home. Then his rope was removed, and they pushed him into a large wooden cage. He spent the rest of the long night trying to make better his anger and wounded pride. He could not understand all that had happened to him. What did these strange men want with him? Why did they keep him locked up in such a small box? Many times during the night he had jumped to his feet when he heard the door open, hoping that he would be greeted by Judge Miller and the boys. But each time it was the ugly face of the barkeeper. Each time the joyful bark that was in his throat turned into a wild growl. The barkeeper left him alone, and in the morning 4 men entered and picked up his cage. Buck decided they were bad men. Their appearance was not clean, and they had mean expressions on their faces. He barked and growled at them through the bars of his cage. The 4 men only laughed and teased him with sticks, which he quickly bit with his teeth until he realized that this was what they wanted. He decided to lay down in a bad mood and was lifted onto a truck. Thus he began his journey through many hands. He went through offices. He was carried aboard another truck with other boxes. Finally, he was put aboard another train car at a huge train station. For 2 days and nights, he sat aboard this train, and for 2 days and nights, Buck neither ate nor drank. He did not mind being hungry, but the lack of water caused him terrible suffering and made his anger even stronger. On top of this, his earlier ill treatment had given him a fever, and his tongue and throat ached unbearably. He was glad for one thing. The rope was off his neck. That had given his enemies an advantage, but now that it was off, Buck decided that he would show them some temper. He decided he would never allow another rope to be put around his neck. The 2 days of hunger and thirst had turned his eyes blood red, and he was so angry that whoever was to deal next with him was in a dangerous position. He had changed into a devil. So changed he was that the judge himself would not have even recognized him. The 4 men who had ridden with him breathed relief when they were finally able to take him off the train in Seattle. They carried his cage to a high-walled backyard. A short man in a red sweater came out and signed for their delivery. Buck knew that this man would be his next enemy, and he ran wildly against the bars, trying to bite him. The man smiled in an evil manner and went back to fetch an axe and a club. "You're not going to take him out now, are you?" one of the men asked in surprise. "Sure," replied the short man, bringing the axe down upon Buck's wooden cage. The 4 men instantly reacted by jumping on top of the high walls, readying themselves for a show. Buck rushed at the broken wood, sinking his teeth into it, shaking it. Every time the axe fell, he was growling and barking, waiting for a chance to get out. "Now, you red-eyed devil," said the man, when he had made an opening large enough for Buck to get out. At the same time, he dropped the axe and picked up the club with his right hand. Buck was truly a red-eyed devil as he made ready to leap out of the box toward the man. He was 140 pounds of pure rage mixed with 2 days' anger of being captured in a cage. Just as his teeth were ready to close on the man, he received a shock that ran through his body and caused him to close his jaws in pain. He turned around in mid-air and fell on his back. Jumping quickly to his feet, he growled in anger and confusion. He had never been hit with a club before and did not understand. With a bark that was also a scream, he jumped again at this attacker, and again he was sent on his back to the ground. He realized it was the club that caused this, but it didn't matter. All his anger and hurt made him charge the man at least 12 times, and each time he was beat and smashed to the ground. After one very strong blow that might have killed a lesser dog, Buck crawled to his feet. But he was too hurt to charge toward the man any more. Blood flowed from his ears, nose, and mouth, spraying his beautiful fur. Then the man came toward him and gave him a frightful strike on the nose. All the pain that Buck had gone through before was nothing compared to this. With a roar that sounded almost like a lion's, Buck again threw himself at the man. But the man, moving the club from his right to left hand, struck Buck under his jaw, sending him to the ground on his head and chest. Buck gathered himself again, and the man struck a final blow that he had been holding back until the right moment. This one knocked all sense out of Buck, and he lay motionless on the ground. "He's a good one at dog-breaking, that's true," said one of the men on the wall. "That man breaks 2 dogs a day and 1 on Sundays," said the driver, as he climbed on the wagon and started the horses. Meanwhile, Buck's senses had returned to him, but he was too weak to move. He lay on the ground, watching the man in the red sweater. "So you answer to the name of Buck," said the man, reading the barkeeper's letter. "Well, Buck, my boy," he continued in a gentler voice, "we've had our little fight, and the best thing we can do is to let it go at that. You've learned your place, and I know mine. Be a good dog, and all will go well. Be a bad dog, and I'll beat the senses out of you again. Understand?" As he spoke, he fearlessly patted Buck's head, the same head he had so badly smashed earlier. Buck's head shook from the man's touch, but there was little he could do but put up with it. When the man brought him water, he drank it quickly, and later he ate a generous amount of raw meat, bit by bit, from the man's hand. He was beaten, he knew that, but not broken. He now understood that he could never beat a man with a club. He had learned a lesson, and he would never forget it his whole life. That club was his introduction into an earlier and primitive law. As the days passed on, he watched other dogs arriving by cage, some peacefully, and some growling and barking as Buck had done. He watched every dog go through the same treatment with the club that he had experienced. Again and again these events became a lesson driven into Buck's mind. A man with a club was a lawgiver, a master to be obeyed. Now and again men came, strangers, who talked excitedly to the man in the red sweater. Sometimes money passed between them, and the strangers took one or more of the dogs away with them. Buck wondered where they went, for they never returned. A fear of the future came over him, and he was glad each time he was not chosen. Yet his time came, in the end, in the form of a little man with dark, tough skin who spoke broken English and said many strange exclamations that Buck could not understand. "My lord," he cried when he saw Buck, "that's one big dog. Eh, how much?" 300, and that's a deal even at that price," was the man's quick reply. "And seeing how you're spending government money, you can't complain." Perrault smiled. He knew that it was not an unfair price for such a fine animal. The Canadian government would not be losing anything. Perrault knew dogs, and when he looked at Buck, he knew he was 1 in 1,000. Even 1 in 10,000, he thought to himself. Money passed between the two men, and Buck was led away, along with a well-behaved dog named Curly. That was the last time that Buck saw the man with the red sweater, and the last time that he saw the warm Southland. Curly and he were taken aboard a ship and given to a black-faced man called Francois. Perrault was a French-Canadian, but Francois was half French-Canadian and stronger. They were a new kind of men to Buck, and while he had no feelings for them, he grew to honestly respect them. He quickly learned that they were fair men, calm and too wise in the way of dogs to be fooled by dogs. On the deck of the ship, Buck and Curly joined 2 other dogs. One of them was a big snow-white dog named Spitz. He was friendly, but too clever to be trusted. He smiled at Buck, but later stole his food during their first meal. Buck jumped up to punish him, but Francois snapped his whip, and all that was left was a bone for him. The other dog did not approach the 3, but stayed alone. Dave was his name, and he clearly showed that he did not want to join the others. Even when the other dogs grew excited, Dave would only raise his head and yawn. Day and night passed aboard the ship, but Buck knew that it was getting colder. At last, one morning the ship was quiet, and the dogs knew that a change was coming soon. Francois tied them together and brought them on deck. Buck's feet stepped on the cold deck, and his feet sank into something like white mud. More of this white stuff was falling through the air. He shook himself and licked some with his tongue. It bit like fire, and this puzzled Buck. He tried to bite the white stuff as it fell through the air, causing the men to laugh. He felt ashamed, but did not know why, for it was his first snow. Chapter 2. The Law of Club and Tooth. Buck's first day on Dyea Beach was a nightmare. Every hour was filled with shock and surprise. He had been taken from the heart of civilization and thrown into the life of the primitive. There was no sunny, easy life, with nothing to do but lie about and be bored. Here was neither peace nor rest, nor safety. All was confusion and action, and every moment was touched with danger. Buck had to be constantly alert, for these dogs and men were not city dogs and men. They were wild, and they knew no other law than the law of club and tooth. He had never seen dogs fight like wolves before, and his first experience taught him a lesson he would never forget. Unfortunately, good-natured Curly was the victim. At camp, she approached a husky, a dog breed with long hair, the size of a wolf, in a friendly manner. There was no warning, only a leap as quick as lightning, a snap of the jaws, and Curly's face was ripped open from eye to jaw. It was the wolf manner of fighting, but there was more to it than this. 30 or 40 huskies ran to the spot and surrounded the two dogs. Buck did not understand their purpose or the way they kept licking their jaws. Curly rushed at her attacker, but he leaped to one side, and she tumbled to her feet. This was what the other huskies were waiting for. They closed the circle upon her, and she lay screaming with pain as they attacked and killed her. This was so sudden that Buck was shocked. He saw that Spitz was laughing, and he saw Francois run into the circle of dogs with his whip. 3 other men with clubs were helping him, but it was too late. Curly lay lifeless in the snow, her body torn to pieces. So that was the way, he thought. No fair play. Once you were down on the ground, it was the end of you. Well, he would see that he never went down. Buck saw Spitz laugh again, and from that moment he hated him with all his strength. Then Buck received another shock. Francois put straps and a harness on him, such as the men would put on horses back at his old home. And as he had seen horses work, so was he made to work, pulling Francois on a sled that was loaded with firewood. Though this further hurt his pride, he was too wise to fight. Francois demanded obedience with his whip. Dave, because of his experience, was placed behind Buck, and he would bite Buck's legs whenever he made an error. Spitz was the leader of the team. Buck learned easily and quickly. 3 very good dogs, Francois told Perrault. That Buck, he pulls like the devil. I think he's quick as anything. By afternoon, Perrault returned with 2 other dogs, Billy and Joe. Though they were brothers, their natures were completely different. Billy was too good-natured, while Joe was always in a sour mood. Buck received them as fellow brothers, but Spitz used the opportunity to establish his authority. Spitz attacked Billy, who was too kind to fight back, biting his leg with his sharp teeth. When Spitz tried to do the same to Joe, Joe faced him and growled so terribly that Spitz had to give up. By evening, Perrault had brought another dog with a scarred face and only one eye. This dog was called Solex, which means the angry one. Even Spitz left him alone. Buck decided to offer his welcome, but he approached Solek from his blind side, which made Solek turn and give Buck a 3-inch deep wound on his shoulder. From then on, Buck made sure not to approach him from his blind side. That night at camp, Buck faced the great problem of sleeping. The tent, glowing warmly with candlelight, looked so inviting. But when Buck tried to enter it, both Francois and Perrault cursed him and threw things at him. He had no choice but to run back outside into the cold. He lay down in the snow and tried to sleep, but the cold soon drove him again to his feet. Wandering from tent to tent, he discovered that every place was just as cold. Suddenly, he had an idea. He decided to find his other teammates and sleep with them. But they had all disappeared. He saw no sign of them anywhere. He circled around and around the tent, getting colder and colder. Suddenly, the snow under his feet fell away and something moved under his feet. He jumped back, expecting the worst. But a friendly bark gave him courage, and he approached again to find Billy curled up under the snow in a comfortable ball. Another lesson. So that was the way they did it, eh? Buck chose a spot and started to dig a hole for himself. Soon the heat from his body filled the hole, and he was dead asleep. The noise of the camp woke him, and at first he did not know where he was. It had snowed during the night, and he was completely covered. A great feeling of fear filled him, the fear that a wild thing has for a trap. It was a sign that he was returning back to an earlier life, like those lived by his ancestors. The muscles of his body tightened, the hair stood up on his neck, and with a wild growl he leaped straight up into the air, sending the snow flying in all directions. A shout from Francois accompanied Buck's leap. "What I say?" he cried to Perrault. "That Buck for certain learns as fast as anything." Perrault nodded in agreement, happy to have chosen such a fine dog. 3 more huskies were added to the team, bringing the total up to 9. Soon they were harnessed and swinging up the path to Daia Canyon. Buck was happy to leave camp, and though the work was hard, he found that he did not dislike it. He was surprised at the excitement of the other dogs, and this had an effect on him. Most surprising was the change that happened in Dave and Solek. They were like new dogs, changed by the harness. Alert and active, they took great delight in their work. Buck had been placed between these 2 dogs on purpose. He was the student, and they the teachers. Whenever Buck made a mistake, he was quickly punished by a quick bite on his rear leg from Dave. But Dave was fair and wise. He never punished without reason, and he never failed to punish if Buck gave him a reason. Also, Buck was under the instruction of Francois's whip. These 2 things quickly made Buck decide that it was easier to follow their instructions than fight against them. Soon he had learned all the basic moves and commands that every sled dog needs to know. His teachers stopped correcting him so much, and Perrault even honored him by lifting up his feet and examining them at night. The next day's run was a hard one, through sheep camp, past the tree line, across ice fields and snow hundreds of feet deep. They made good time down the chain of lakes that were once live volcanoes, and late at night they pulled into the huge camp at the head of Lake Bennett. Thousands of men seeking gold were there, and Buck made his hole and slept the sleep of the truly tired. It was all too early for him when he was awakened and harnessed again to the sled. That day they made 40 miles, but the next day, and the many that followed, they made poorer time. As a rule, Perrault traveled ahead of the team, packing down the snow with his special shoes. He prided himself on his knowledge of ice, a knowledge that one can not do without in the frozen Northland. Day after day, Buck worked hard. They always stopped at dark and made camp, and they also woke in the dark. The first gray of dawn found them with many miles behind them. When darkness came again, they would camp again, eat their bits of fish, and dig their holes to sleep in the snow. Buck was terribly hungry most of the time. His amount of food seemed to go nowhere, even though his masters gave him more food than the other dogs. Because of his huge size, he constantly suffered from hunger pains. He quickly lost the slowness and humbleness of his old life. When he first arrived, he learned that he had to eat quickly to stop the other dogs from stealing his food. Now he ate as fast as the other dogs, and sometimes he was so hungry that he even stole food from the other dogs. Once he saw a dog steal food from Perrault's sack of food. He quickly did the same, managing to steal a whole piece of meat. Perrault did not catch Buck, though later, when he discovered the missing food, he blamed another dog. This first theft marked Buck's ability to survive in the unfriendly and unforgiving Northland. It showed his ability to change himself to fit conditions. Not having these qualities meant certain death. Now, his moral nature, his decision between right and wrong, was also breaking down. It was well enough in the Southland, where law was love and friendship. But in the Northland, under the law of club and tooth, certain actions were necessary. Those who didn't follow this way were fools. Not that Buck thought out his actions. He was fit, and unknowingly he fitted himself to his new lifestyle. Throughout his earlier days, he had never run from a fight. But the man with the red sweater had beaten into him a more primitive lesson than pride. His stealing was an example of this. He did not steal for the fun of it, but because of the pains in his stomach. He did not steal in the open, but secretly. In short, things were done because it was easier to do them than not to do them. His development, or undevelopment, was fast. His muscles became hard as iron, and ordinary pain no longer bothered him. He could eat anything, even if he hated it. Sight and smell became amazingly sharp, while his hearing was so good that he could decide if the smallest sound meant help or danger. He knew how to smell the air and know which way the wind would blow during the night, a valuable gift when making camp in the wilderness. It seemed that instincts that were long dead became alive again. Generations of being taken care of by man fell away from him. He remembered back to the early days of his kind, when wild dogs killed their own meat as they ran through the forest. It was not difficult for him to learn to fight like a wolf, cut and snap, then away again. These came to him without effort or discovery, like they had always been his. And when, on cold, still nights, he pointed his nose at a star and howled long like a wolf, it was his ancestors, now dead and turned to dust, pointing their noses and howling down through the centuries and through him. And his rhythm was their rhythm, the rhythm that gave voice to their pain, and what to them was the meaning of the stillness, the cold and dark. Thus, an old song was part of Buck, and he came into his own again. He was this way because men had found gold in the north, and because Manuel was a gardener whose wages could not cover his gambling problem. Chapter 3. The Stronger Primitive Beast. Because of the changes in Buck, Spitz began to give him trouble. He seemed to know that Buck could be a dangerous enemy, so he always took the opportunity to try to fight with Buck. If started, this fight could only end in the death of one or the other. Early in the trip, this might have taken place had it not been for an accident. They made a small and miserable camp on the shore of a lake at the end of one day. The weather was terrible, with freezing winds and driving snow. At their backs was a wall of rock, and the two men had to camp on the ice of the frozen lake. They only had a few sticks for firewood, and after cooking they ate their supper in darkness. Buck made his hole under the sheltering rock. He was so warm and comfortable that he hated to leave it when Francois called the dogs for dinner. When Buck finished his meal, he found that Spitz had taken the opportunity to steal his hole. Up to that point, Buck had avoided trouble with Spitz, but this was too much. The beast within him roared. He sprang upon Spitz with an anger that surprised them both. Francois was surprised too. "Ah!" he cried to Buck. "Give it to him, the dirty thief!" Spitz was just as willing as Buck to fight. He was crying out in anger and eagerness as he circled Buck, waiting for a chance to jump on him. But then something unexpected happened. A shout was heard from Perrault, and then total confusion came upon the camp. Starving huskies, about 20 of them, had invaded the camp, attracted by the smell of food. A couple of dogs went straight for the food box, and even though Perrault and Francois beat them with clubs, they paid no attention to the blows, only leaving once the last bit of food had been eaten. In the meantime, the surprised team dogs had jumped out of their nests, only to be set upon by the fierce invaders. Buck had never seen such dogs before. It seemed their bones would burst through their skins. Their hunger, madness, and disease had made them crazy, and there was no fighting them. The team dogs were backed up against a cliff, and Buck was attacked by 3 huskies. His head and shoulders were bitten and ripped. Billy was crying as usual. Dave and Solek, dripping with blood from their wounds, were fighting bravely side by side. Joe was snapping his mouth at his attackers like a devil. Joe bit into the front leg of a husky, wounding him. Buck used the opportunity to grab the dog by the throat. His teeth tore open the throat, and Buck felt his mouth fill with warm blood. This was a new and strange feeling for Buck, and it made him fight even harder. He jumped upon another, and at the same time he felt teeth sink into his own throat. It was Spitz attacking him from the side. Buck knew that he would die if Spitz knocked him down in the middle of these starving huskies. He stood ready for Spitz's jump, fully aware that Spitz was also an enemy. But Spitz didn't jump. He was again attacked by the huskies. Just then, Perrault and Francois came running, trying to save their dogs. They fought back the huskies while leading their dogs across the frozen lake. In this way, the 9 team dogs and the 2 men finally reached the safety of the forest. Both men and dogs were all in a sorry way. There was not one who was not wounded in 4 or 5 places, while others were wounded even more seriously. Dub was badly injured in his back leg. Dolly, the last addition to the team in Daia, had a throat wound. Joe had lost an eye, while Billy, the good-natured one, with an ear that was chewed to pieces, cried throughout the night. On top of this, there was a chance that the dogs could become infected with the same disease that made the other dogs go crazy. At daybreak, they slowly went back to camp, to find the huskies gone and their camp destroyed. Over half of their food supply was gone. The huskies had chewed through the sled ropes and canvas tents. In fact, nothing, no matter eatable or not, had escaped their teeth. They had eaten a pair of Perrault's leather boots, as well as 2 feet of Francois's whip. Francois became terribly sad when he looked at the camp and then at the state of his dogs. "Ah, my friends," he said softly, "maybe you will all become mad dogs like them. What do you think, Perrault?" Perrault shook his head in sadness. With 400 miles between them and Dawson, they couldn't afford to have any disease break out among the dogs. With half of their supplies gone, the hardest part of the journey in front of them, the team set out 2 hours later toward Dawson. The 30-mile river was wide open. Its wild waters did not freeze, even though the temperature was below 50. 6 days of exhausting work were needed to cover these terrible 30 miles, where every place put the lives of the team at risk. More than 10 times Perrault fell through the ice, saved only by his long pole. Each time this happened, the team was forced to stop and build a fire. Perrault faced danger bravely. It was his skill and bravery that had gotten him this job for the government. He took all risks, determined to struggle from morning to night. Once, the sled broke through the ice, and Dave and Buck were half frozen by the time they were dragged out of the lake. The usual fire was necessary to save them. Their fur was covered in ice, and Francois had to make the dogs run around the fire. Some of their fur was even burnt from the flames. Another time, Spitz fell through the ice, dragging the whole team except for Buck and Dave with him into the water. By the time they made the Hootalinqua, where the good and solid ice was at, Buck was nearly dead from pulling. The rest of the team was in the same condition, but Perrault, to make up lost time, continued to push them ahead. The first day they covered 35 miles to Big Fish. The next day, 35 miles to Little Fish. The third day, 40 miles that finally brought them into Five Fingers. Buck's feet were not as hard as the other huskies. His had softened from the many generations since his last wild ancestor was taken and cared for by primitive man. All day long he walked in pain, and when camp was made, he lay down like a dead dog. Hungry as he was, he couldn't move to eat his food, which Francois had to bring to him. Also, the dog driver rubbed Buck's feet for 30 minutes every night, and used his own boots to make 4 small boots for Buck. This provided a great relief for Buck, and Francois had to laugh at the way Buck would lay on his back every morning, his 4 feet waving in the air, waiting for his boots to be put on. Later, his feet grew harder, and his worn-out boots were thrown away. One morning, as Francois and Perrault were harnessing the dogs, Dolly suddenly let out a long, heartbreaking wolf cry that struck fear in every dog. She had gone mad, and she made a wild jump at Buck. He had never seen another dog break down and go mad before, but he knew enough to run away. Dolly immediately set off after him. Buck couldn't get far enough away, so great was her madness, nor could Dolly get close enough to Buck, so great was his fear. Finally, he heard Francois call to him, and he ran back toward camp, putting all his belief into Francois's help. The dog driver held an axe in his hand, and as Buck shot past him, the axe crashed down upon Dolly's head. Buck lay down next to the sled, exhausted and helpless. This was Spitz's opportunity. He sprang upon Buck, and twice his teeth sank into Buck and tore his flesh to the bone. Then Francois hit Spitz with the whip, and Buck had the satisfaction of watching Spitz get the worst whipping ever given to any member of the team. "One devil he is," remarked Perrault. "Some day he'll kill Buck." "But Buck is 2 devils," said Francois. From then on, it was war between them. Spitz, as the leader and master of the team, felt afraid of losing his position to Buck. Spitz had never met such a clever and hard enemy. Buck had learned something from the man in the red sweater with the club. Buck could wait with a patience that was nothing short of primitive. The fight for leadership could not be helped. Buck wanted it. He wanted it because it was his nature, because he had been caught by a wish for mastery that he himself couldn't understand. It was the same desire that made the dogs work themselves until they died, that broke their hearts when they could no longer work as sled dogs. This was the pride that Dave and Sulek had, the pride that came over them at camp, turning them from sad and lazy dogs into eager and willing sled dogs. It was also the pride that made Spitz fear Buck as a possible leader, and this was Buck's pride too. Buck openly fought with Spitz for leadership. He would stand between Spitz and another dog when Spitz was punishing another. He did this on purpose. One morning, Pike did not appear, and Spitz was growling in anger. When Pike eventually came up from his nest in the ground, Spitz made ready to jump on him and punish him. but Buck flew between them in anger. This was so unexpected to Spitz that he fell backward and off his feet. Pike, sensing that Spitz was weakened, took the opportunity to attack Spitz. Buck, forgetting the rules of fairness, also joined Pike. But Francois brought his whip upon Buck, letting him know with each blow that such behavior wasn't allowed, even if he was standing up against Spitz. In this way, his masters were fair to all the dogs. In the days that followed, with Dawson growing closer and closer, Buck still continued to trouble Spitz, but he did this secretly when Francois was not around. Soon, a common disrespect for Spitz as leader grew among the other dogs. Things no longer went right. There was continual fighting. Trouble was always happening, and Buck was the cause of it. Francois was busy trying to keep order among the team. The dog driver was in constant fear of the day when Spitz and Buck would have a life-or-death fight, and he knew that it was set to happen. On many nights, he would rush out of his tent at the sound of fighting. But the fight didn't happen before they reached Dawson. One cloudy afternoon they pulled into town, finding many men and countless dogs hard at work. It seemed the natural order that dogs should work for men. All day long teams of dogs ran up and down the main street, pulling heavy loads on their sleds. Here, dogs did the same work that horses did back in the Southlands. Buck met other dogs from the Southlands. At night he would join them in their singing. Under the light of a moon that glowed in the snow, this song of the huskies spoke of the continual fight for existence. It was an old song, one of the first songs of a younger world in a day when songs were sad. When Buck sang, it was with the pain of living that was the same pain of his ancestors before. The fear and mystery of the cold and dark were the same fear and mystery that had troubled past generations. And the fact that Buck howled at night was a sign that he had gone back to an older nature, back to the very beginnings of an age of howling. 7 days after being in Dawson, they made their way toward Dyea and Saltwater. Perrault had important packages to deliver for the trip, and he hoped to arrive in record time. The rest had put the dogs in good shape, and their sled was quite light. They made 60 miles, which is actually only a 50-mile run, in the first day. On the second day, they were on their way to Pelly. But such good travel put hardship on the dogs. The fighting between Spitz and Buck had destroyed the team's spirit of working together as one. It was no longer as one dog pulling the sled, but like 9 individual dogs. No more was Spitz a great leader to be feared. The other dogs started to challenge the authority of Spitz, stealing his food and openly fighting with him. The breaking down of Spitz's leadership likewise affected the dogs in their relationship with one another. They fought and argued more than ever among themselves. Dave and Solek were the only ones unchanged, but they were bothered by the constant fighting. Francois ran about in anger, trying to keep order, but the minute he turned his back, the dogs would start again. Tearing his hair, Francois cursed Buck, for he knew that Buck was behind all the trouble. But Buck was too clever to be caught, and he still continued to work faithfully in the harness, though he also took pleasure in making trouble. One night, after supper, at the mouth of the Tahkeena River, a rabbit came into camp. Soon the whole team was chasing it. They were joined in the chase by 50 other huskies from a neighboring camp. The rabbit sped down the river, running lightly on the snow, while the dogs ran heavily behind. Buck led the other dogs, but he could not catch the rabbit. He ran low to the ground, his wonderful body flashing leap by leap in the moonlight. And leap by leap the rabbit flashed ahead of him. All the old instincts which make men leave cities and go to forests to hunt and kill, all this was Buck's, only it was closer. He was leading the other dogs, running after living meat, to kill with his own teeth and wash his mouth in warm blood. There is a joy that marks life, a joy that comes when one is most alive, and strangely, when one forgets that one is alive. This forgetfulness comes to the artist, caught in his own creation, and it comes to the war-mad soldier on the field. Now it came to Buck, leading the others, sounding the wolf cry, chasing after the food that was alive. He was living from the deepest part of his nature, going back into time itself. He was mastered by life, the power of being, the perfect joy of each muscle and bone expressing itself in movement, flying under the stars and over the dead snow. But Spitz had other plans. He broke away from the others, cutting across a thin piece of land. Buck did not know this, and as he watched the rabbit leap in front of him, he saw a larger form leap into the path of the rabbit. It was Spitz. The rabbit could not turn, and as Spitz's white teeth bit into its back, it cried aloud in pain. At the sound of this cry, the other dogs stopped and howled in delight. But Buck did not cry out. He didn't even stop, but drove himself into Spitz so hard that he missed the throat. They rolled over and over in the snow. Spitz jumped to his feet and bit Buck on the shoulder, ripping the flesh before jumping back. In an instant, Buck knew that the time had come. It was to the death. He seemed to remember it all, the white woods, the moonlight, the circle of dogs that watched them. They too, like the night, were silent. Only their eyes were glowing. To Buck it was nothing new or strange, but a scene from old time. Spitz was an experienced fighter. He had fought with many dogs in his life and achieved mastery over them. He was angry, but not blind with anger. In his desire to destroy, he never forgot that his enemy also wanted to destroy him as well. He never attacked without first defending his attack. Buck tried to sink his teeth into Spitz, but to no use. His teeth met Spitz's teeth, and Buck's mouth was soon bleeding from his attempts. Every time that he rushed toward Spitz, Spitz would jump aside and cut Buck before jumping away. Then he tried to knock Spitz over, but Spitz would tear at Buck's shoulder before leaping lightly away. Spitz was untouched, while Buck was covered in wounds that dripped blood. The fight was growing more serious. All the while the circle of dogs silently waited. They wanted to finish off whichever dog went down. As Buck became more tired, Spitz started to rush toward him. Once Buck was knocked over, and the circle of dogs started up, but he quickly jumped to his feet, and the circle sank down again and waited. But Buck had a quality that made for greatness, imagination. He fought by instinct, but he could also fight using his head as well. He rushed forward, as if to try to knock Spitz down by his shoulder, but at the last second he bent low in the snow and his teeth bit into one of Spitz's front legs. He repeated this trick 3 times, and Spitz was struggling madly to keep up. He saw the circle of dogs moving silently closer, just as he had seen similar circles close in on his beaten enemies. Only this time he was the one who was beaten. There was no hope for him. Buck was unbeatable. The circle was so close that Buck could feel the other dogs at his back legs. Then a pause seemed to fall. Every dog was motionless, as if turned to stone. Only Spitz moved and fell, trying to fight an approaching death. Then Buck sprang upon Spitz, knocking him over. Buck jumped back and looked on as the circle closed in upon Spitz. Buck was the successful winner, the leader of primitive animal who had made his kill and found it good. Chapter 4. The Leadership. The next morning Francois awoke to find that Spitz was missing, while Buck stood covered in cuts and blood. "What? I say I was speaking the truth when I said that Buck is 2 devils. He took Buck closer to the fire so that Perrault could look at the wounds from the fight. "That Spitz sure fights like hell, though," said Perrault, as he looked Buck over from head to toe. "Yeah, but Buck, he fights like two hells," was Francois's answer. "And now we can make good time and travel faster. There won't be any more trouble now that Spitz is gone." Perrault packed up the camp while Francois started to harness the dogs. Buck ran up to the place that Spitz used to have as the leader, but Francois didn't notice this and brought Sol-leks up instead. Francois believed that Sol-leks should be the next dog for leadership because of his strength and experience. But Buck thought differently, and he jumped upon Sol-leks in anger, driving him back and standing in his place. "Hey, look at this," Francois cried. "Look at that Buck. He killed Spitz, and now he thinks that he can take his job too. Go away," he yelled at Buck, but Buck refused to move. He took Buck by the back of his neck and dragged Buck, who was growling, back to Sol-leks' old place in the line. Sol-leks did not like this, and plainly showed that he was afraid of Buck. Francois had made up his mind, but when he turned his back, Sol-leks was again in his old place, while Buck was at the front. Now Francois was angry. "Now get back, or I'll fix you," he cried, coming back with a heavy club in his hand. Buck remembered the man in the red sweater and slowly moved away from Francois. Still, he circled in anger and bitterness, waiting to move aside if Francois decided to use the club. When Francois tried to harness Buck in front of Dave, Buck moved back a few steps. Francois thought that Buck was afraid of the club and put it down. Then he went back to the harness, but Buck refused to come. Buck was in open revolt against them. He did not fear the club. He wanted leadership, a position he felt he had a right to, one that he had won. He had earned it and wouldn't be happy with anything less. Perrault decided to help Francois. For the better part of an hour they chased after him and threw clubs at him, but they couldn't get him even close to the harness. They cursed him while he ran between them, keeping out of their reach. He did not try to run away, but circled the camp, letting both men know that when his wishes were met, he would come in and be good. Francois sat down and scratched his head. Then Perrault looked at his watch and started to curse. Time was flying, and they should have been traveling for an hour by now. Francois scratched his head again and looked questioningly at Perrault. Perrault only lifted his shoulders, as if to say they were beaten. So Francois went up to Sol-leks and moved him back to his old place by Dave. From a distance Buck saw this and laughed, as dogs laugh, but he still kept far away. "Throw down your club," Perrault said to Francois. Francois did this, and Buck came running in, laughing in victory. He moved into his position at the head of the team. He was fastened to the harness, and the sled broke out, starting its journey on the river trail. Francois soon realized, while the day was still young, that he had undervalued Buck's skill. Buck immediately took up the duties and responsibilities of leadership. He showed that he was a better leader than Spitz, whom Francois had never seen an equal. But it was in giving out the law and making his mates live up to it that Buck showed his true self. Dave and Sol-leks did not mind the change in leadership. Their busyness was to work, and all else mattered little. The rest of the team, however, had grown undisciplined during Spitz's rule, and were now greatly surprised as Buck started to get them into shape. Pike, who never put in more effort than was required, was disciplined for being lazy. Before the end of the first day, he was pulling more than he had ever pulled in his whole life. The first night in camp, Bad-natured Joe was punished, which was a thing that Spitz had never succeeded in doing. Buck, because of his enormous size, simply sat on top of Joe until he whined for mercy and agreed to behave himself. The general state of the team picked up immediately. It again found its unity, and the dogs once more leaped together as one dog. At the Rink Rapids, 2 native huskies, Teak and Kuna, were added. The skill and quickness with which Buck established the rules with them took Francois's breath away. "Never have I seen a dog like Buck," he cried. "No, never. He's worth $1,000, by God. What do you say, Perrault?" Perrault nodded his head in agreement. He was ahead of the record then, and gaining day by day. The trail was in excellent condition, and there was no new-fallen snow to slow them down. It was not too cold. Both men and dogs rode on satisfied. The 30-mile river was almost covered with ice, and they managed to ride out in one day what had taken them 10 days going in. In one run they made 60 miles from the foot of Lake Labarge to the White Horse Rapids. Across 70 miles of lakes they rode so hard that one of the men had to hang on to a rope to keep up with the sled. On the last night of the second week they made it over White Pass and saw the lights of Skagway below them. It was a record run. Each day, for 14 days, they averaged about 40 miles. For 3 days, Perrault and Francois had invitations to drink, while the team was the constant center of attention for a worshipping crowd. But official orders for work soon arrived, and Francois called to Buck, threw his arms around him, and cried over him. That was the last of Francois and Perrault. Like other men, they passed out of Buck's life for good. A man from Scotland took charge of Buck and his team, and accompanied by 6 other dog teams, he started on the tiring trail back to Dawson. It was no longer any light running, but heavy work every day with a heavy load behind them. This was the mail train, carrying written word from the world to the men who looked for gold in the frozen Northlands. Buck did not like it, but he did well, taking pride in his job. Like Dave and Sol-leks. It was often boring, with every day the same as the other. At a certain time each morning fires were built, breakfast was cooked and eaten, and they broke out of camp, on their way an hour or so before the darkness gave way to the dawn. At night, camp was made and the dogs were fed. There was little trouble from the other 50 or so dogs that they traveled with. A couple of times Buck had to fight to show his leadership, but often a growl was enough to stop others. Best of all, Buck loved to lie near the fire, his back legs under him with his front ones stretched out. He would look dreamily into the flames. Sometimes he thought of Judge Miller's big house in the sunny valley, and of Isabel and Toots, the 2 dogs he used to see there. But more often he remembered the man in the red sweater, the death of Curly, the great fight with Spitz, and all the good things he had eaten. The Sunland was becoming distant in his memory, and these memories no longer had any power over him. Far stronger were the memories of his ancestors, which made many new things seem familiar. His instincts quickened and became alive again. Sometimes, as he sat by the fire, it seemed that the flames were of another fire, and he would see a different man than the Scotsman beside him. This man had shorter legs and longer arms, and his hair was long and low on his forehead. He made strange sounds and seemed very afraid of the darkness. He always raised his club high over his head whenever he heard any sounds in the dark. This man wore little clothing, but on his body there was much hair. In some places, like his chest and shoulders, this hair looked almost like thick fur. He did not stand up straight and walked on legs that were bent at the knees. At times this hairy man sat by the fire with his head between his legs and slept. His elbows would rest on his knees, and his arms would cover his head. Beyond the fire, Buck could see many shining pairs of eyes. and he knew these were the eyes of huge animals who wanted to eat the man. He could hear their bodies crashing through the trees and the noises they made at night. And dreaming there by the fire, these sights and sounds of another world would make the hair stand up along his back and neck till he growled softly. Then the Scotsman would shout at him, "Hey, Buck, wake up!" The other world disappeared, and the real world would come to his eyes, and Buck would get up and stretch himself. It was a hard trip, and the work wore the dogs down. They had lost weight and were in poor condition by the time they pulled into Dawson. They should have had at least a week's or 10 days' rest. But in 2 days they were on the trail again, loaded with letters for the outside. The dogs were tired, the owners in a bad way, and to make matters worse, it snowed every day. This meant a soft trail and heavier pulling for the dogs. Yet the drivers were fair and did their best for the dogs. Each night the dogs ate before the men did, and no man would go to sleep without first checking on the dogs' feet. Still, the strength of the team went down. Since the beginning of winter they had traveled 1,800 miles, and 1,800 miles will wear down the strongest of teams. Buck did well, keeping the other dogs up to their work. Billy cried regularly in his sleep each night. Joe was sourer than ever, and Sol-leks completely unfriendly. But it was Dave who suffered the most. Something had gone wrong with him. The drivers had to feed him in his hole, and he did not get on his feet again until harness time in the morning. Sometimes, when the sled took a sudden turn, he would cry out with pain. The driver examined him. Something was wrong inside, but they could not find any broken bones. His condition began to puzzle the whole team. By the time they reached Cassiar Bar, Dave was so weak that he kept falling down. The driver took him out of the team so as to let Dave run free behind the sled. Sick as he was, Dave did not like being taken out, and he whined broken-heartedly when Sol-leks replaced him. Dave could not bear that another dog should do his work, and this was the pride that would make him work until he was dead. When the sled started again, Dave started to attack Sol-leks, trying to get between him and the sled, all the while whining and crying with pain. The driver used the whip, but Dave paid no attention, and the man did not have the heart to strike harder. Then exhaustion finally got the best of Dave, and he fell in the snow, howling as the sled went by. With the last bit of his strength, Dave managed to run behind the sled until they made a stop. He walked until he was standing by Sol-leks. The driver looked at Dave while he lit his pipe. After resting for a while, he made the signal for the dogs to start. They ran quickly off, then turned around and stopped in surprise. The driver was surprised too. The sled had not moved. Bending down to look at the ropes, he saw that Dave had bitten through Sol-leks' harness and was standing directly in front of the sled in his proper place. His eyes showed that he wanted to remain there. The driver was confused. He had heard that a dog could break its heart if it wasn't allowed to work. Even if it meant death, an old or injured dog would continue. The driver decided that if Dave was to die anyway, he should die in his place with his heart easy and content. So he harnessed Dave again, and proudly did he pull, even though he cried out in pain several times. He fell down several times, but he held through until they reached camp. The driver made Dave a place by the fire. By morning he was too weak to travel. He tried to crawl to his place in front of the sled, slowly moving his front and then his back legs. His strength left him, and the last the others saw of him, he lay struggling for breath in the snow. But they could hear his sad howling till they passed beyond a belt of trees. Here they stopped. The Scotsmen slowly walked back the way they had come. The other men stopped talking. A gunshot rang out in the air. The Scotsmen came quickly back. The whips snapped, the small bells on the ropes rang, and the sleds moved along the trail. But Buck knew, and every dog knew, what had taken place behind the belt of trees. Chapter 5. The Work of the Trail. 30 days from the time they left Dawson, the team arrived at Skagway. They were in a terrible state. Buck now weighed 115 pounds, compared to his earlier weight of 140. The rest of the team also suffered. Sol-leks could hardly walk, and the other dogs had shoulder wounds from the ropes. Their feet fell heavily on the trail, making double their tiredness from travel. There was nothing the matter with them except that they were dead tired. It was not a tiredness that could be cured by resting a couple of hours, but one that comes through too many months of work. There was no power to heal, no strength left to call upon. It had all been used, the last least bit of it. Every muscle, every cell was tired, dead tired. And there was reason for it. In less than 5 months, they had traveled 2,500 miles. During the last 1,800, they had only had 5 days' rest. They arrived at Skagway on their last legs. "Go on, poor sore feet," the driver said as they slowly dragged the sled through the main streets of Skagway. "This is the last one, and then we'll get a nice long rest for sure. It will be one very long rest." The drivers were certain about expecting a long stop. They themselves had covered over 1,200 miles with only 2 days of rest. They deserved a long vacation. But so many men had rushed into Klondike, and so many were their relatives back home, that the mail was becoming as huge as a mountain. Besides, there were official orders from the government to work immediately. Fresh dogs were to replace the ones who couldn't work, and those that couldn't work were sold. 3 days passed, and Buck and his teammates discovered how tired they really were. Then, on the morning of the 4th day, 2 men from the States came along and bought them, harness and all, for almost nothing. The men called each other Hal and Charles. Charles was a middle-aged man with weak and watery eyes. Hal was a young man of about 20 who carried a handgun called a Colt and wore a huge hunting knife on his belt. The belt was covered with bullets, and it was the most noticeable thing about him. It showed the lowness of his character. Both men were completely out of place, and why they had decided to adventure in the Northland is part of the mystery of things. Buck heard the money passed between the men and the government official. He knew that the Scotsmen and the other men were passing out of his life like Francois and Perrault had done. When driven with his mates to the new owner's camp, Buck saw a camp that was not in order and messy, a tent half-stretched, dishes unwashed. Also he saw a woman, Mercedes, the men called her. She was Charles's wife and Hal's sister, a nice family party. Buck watched uneasily as they tried to take down the tent and load the sled. They used a great deal of effort, but no businesslike manner. The tent was rolled into a size 3 times what it should have been, and the dishes packed away unwashed. Mercedes continually walked among the men, giving advice. After they loaded up their cloth sack, she discovered other things that needed packing, and they unloaded again. 3 men from a neighboring tent came out and looked on, smiling and winking to each other. "You've got too big of a load right now," said one of them, "and though it's none of my business to tell you what to do, I wouldn't bother to take the tent if I were you."
"Not take the tent?"
cried Mercedes.
"How can I manage without a tent?"
"It's springtime. There won't be any more cold weather," the man replied. She shook her head in a decided way, and Hal and Charles put the last items on the huge load. "Think it'll ride?" asked one of the men. "Why shouldn't it?" demanded Charles. "Oh, that's all right. I didn't mean anything by that," the man quickly said. "I was just wondering, it seems pretty heavy on top." "And I'm sure those dogs can pull all day with that load," said the other man. "Certainly," said Hal with freezing politeness, taking hold of the whip. "Go!" he shouted. "Get going!" The dogs pulled with all their might, but they couldn't go anywhere. They were unable to move the sled. "Those lazy animals! I'll show them!" Hal cried, preparing to strike them with the whip. But Mercedes ran up to him crying,
"Oh, Hal, you mustn't!"
as she caught hold of his arm.
"The poor dears! Now you must promise you won't be hard on them for the rest of the trip, or I won't go another step."
"You don't know anything about dogs," her brother replied, "and I wish you'd leave me alone. They're lazy, I tell you, and you need to whip them to get anything out of them. That's their way. Ask any of those men." Mercedes looked at them, a look on her face that showed her dislike for pain. "They're weak as water, if you want to know," came a reply from one of the men. "They need rest. That's the matter." "Rest be damned," said Hal, and Mercedes jumped in surprise at his answer. But she was a family person and rushed to defend her brother.
"Never mind what he said. You drive the dogs the way you think you should."
Again, Hal's whip fell on the dogs. They threw themselves forward, dug their feet into the packed snow, and put forth all their strength. The sled didn't move 1 inch. After 2 more efforts, they stood still. When the whip whistled again, Mercedes again stepped forward. She dropped on her knees beside Buck, with tears in her eyes, and put her arms around his neck.
"You poor, poor dears,"
she cried.
"Why don't you pull hard? Then you wouldn't be whipped."
Buck did not like her, but he felt too weak to move, taking it as part of the day's terrible work. One of the men, who had been holding his words, now spoke up. "It's not that I care one bit about what happens to you, but to help the dogs, I'll tell you that you need to break the sled out of the ice. It's frozen in the ice. Throw your weight to the right and then to the left and break out the sled." Following the advice, Hal broke out the sled, and it moved forward slowly. Under a rain of whip strikes, Buck and his mates struggled with all their might. 100 yards ahead, the street turned sharply into the main street. It would have taken an experienced driver to keep the sled from falling over, and Hal was not such a man. As they swung around the turn, the sled fell over, spilling half of their stuff onto the street. The dogs never stopped. They dragged the lightened sled on its side behind them. They were angry at their unfair treatment. Hal cried, "Stop! Stop!" But they paid no attention. He tripped and was pulled off his feet. The sled ran over him, and the dogs continued to run up the street, spilling the rest of the supplies onto the street. Finally, some kind-hearted citizens of Skagway stopped the dogs and gathered up the spilled belongings. They gave advice, half the load and twice the dogs, if they ever expected to reach Dawson. Hal and his sister listened against their will and started to get rid of some of their things. They threw out canned goods, which made many people laugh, for the idea of taking canned goods on a long trail was completely foolish. "Looks like you're starting a hotel," said one of the men. "Even half of these blankets is too much. Throw away that tent and those dishes. You aren't washing them anyway. Good Lord, do you think you're traveling on a train?" And so it happened. Mercedes cried when her clothes bags were dumped on the ground and piece by piece were thrown out. She promised she would not go 1 inch, even if it meant leaving her husband. Finally, wiping her eyes, she started to throw away even necessary items. Then she started on the possessions of the 2 men, attacking them with the same energy. This finished, the load, though cut in half, was still very large. Charles and Hal went out later in the evening and bought 6 other dogs. This brought the number of the team up to 14. But the new dogs were not very good. They did not seem to know anything. Buck and the other dogs looked at the new dogs with disgust. Buck was able to teach them their places, but he couldn't teach them what they had to do. They did not like to be harnessed to the sled. Also, because they were not used to the hard environment of the north, many of them had lost their spirit. Bones were the only thing breakable about them. With the new dogs hopeless and homesick, and the old team worn out by 2,500 miles of continuous work, the future of the trip did not look very good. The 2 men, however, were quite cheerful, and they were proud too. They believed that owning a team of 14 dogs was a great thing. However, there was a reason why 14 dogs should not drag one sled, and that was because one sled could not carry enough food for 14 dogs. But Charles and Hal did not know this. They had worked the trip out by pencil, so much to a dog, and so many days. With Mercedes agreeing with everything they said, it all looked so very simple. Late next morning, Buck led the team up the street. There was no energy in him or in his mates. They were starting the journey dead tired. 4 times they had covered the distance between Saltwater and Dawson, and the knowledge that he was facing the same journey again put him in a bad mood. His heart was not in the work, nor was the heart of any dog. The new dogs were nervous and frightened, and the old dogs had no confidence in their new masters. Somehow, Buck knew that he could not expect anything from these 2 men and 1 woman. They did not know how to do anything, and as the days passed, it became clear that they could not learn. They were lazy in all things, without order or discipline. It took them half the night to set up camp, and half the morning to pack up the camp and get the sled loaded. Also, they loaded the sled in such a disorderly way that they often had to stop to rearrange their load. Some days they did not make it 10 miles. Other days they were unable to get started at all. And on no day did they make even half the distance needed to make sure that their food supply lasted. It was no surprise that they should go short of dog food. They added to the problem by giving the dogs too much food. The new dogs, because they were not used to the cold, needed more food. Because the older dogs were so tired, Hal decided that he needed to double their food amount to give them more energy. On top of this, Mercedes would steal fish from the food bags to feed them even more. But it was not food that Buck and the other huskies needed, it was rest. They were making poor time, and the heavy load took away all their strength. Then came the time when they had to give the dogs less food. Hal discovered one day that half of his food supply was gone, while only 1/4 of the distance was covered. There was no way to get more food. So he cut down the amount and tried to increase the day's travel. It was a simple matter to give the dogs less food, but another matter to travel faster. Their late morning starts did not help them travel longer hours. They did not know how to work the dogs, and they did not know how to work themselves. The first dog to go was Dub. His shoulder had been hurt before the trip, and now it was so bad that he could no longer get up. One day, Hal had to shoot him. Next, the new dogs started to get sick from lack of food. Soon, most of the new dogs had died as well. By this time, all the dreams and beauty of the Northland had fallen away from these Southland people. Arctic travel had become too hard a reality for their manhood and womanhood. Mercedes stopped crying over the dogs and started to cry for herself. Also, she often fought with her brother and husband. Though they were often dead tired themselves, it seemed that arguing and fighting were two things they always had energy for. The patience that often develops in men who work hard on the trail did not come to them at all. They were always in pain. Their muscles hurt, their bones hurt, and their hearts hurt. Because of this, their words to one another became unkind, and hard words were the first thing on their lips in the morning and the last thing at night. Charles and Hal constantly fought whenever Mercedes wasn't between them. Each believed that he alone was doing his fair share of work, while the other was lazy. Sometimes Mercedes would stand up for her husband, sometimes for her brother. The result was a family battle that never stopped. Starting with a job about who should gather wood for the fire, an argument would begin that involved the rest of the family. Fathers, mothers, uncles, even dead relatives were argued about. That Hal's views on art should have anything to do with gathering firewood is beyond understanding. Nevertheless, the argument was as likely to go in that direction as in the direction of Charles's political views. In the meantime, the fire remained unbuilt, the camp half made, and the dogs unfed. Mercedes had a special problem, the problem of being a woman. She was pretty and soft and had been treated as such all her life. But her brother and husband did not treat her like this now. Instead, they complained about her helplessness. With her complaining, she made their lives even worse. She no longer thought about the dogs, and because she was tired and had many pains, she demanded to ride on the sled. She was pretty and soft, but she weighed 120 pounds. This was another heavy load for the weak and starving dogs. She rode for days till the dogs fell down and the sled stood still. Charles and Hal begged her to get off and walk. Then she wept and asked heaven to remember their unkindness. Because of their own sufferings, they did not notice the sufferings of the dogs. Hal's belief, which he practiced on others, was that one must become hard to suffering. He had started by telling his sister and brother-in-law this. Failing this, he beat it into the dogs with a club. At 5 fingers, the dog food ran out, and a toothless old Indian woman offered to trade a few pounds of frozen horse meat for Hal's gun. This also ran out after a few days. Through it all, Buck pulled the team along as if in a nightmare. He pulled when he could, and when he couldn't, he fell down in the snow and remained there until the whip or the club drove him to his feet again. The shine had gone out of his hair, and it was covered in blood from Hal's whip. His muscles had wasted away to almost nothing, and it was possible to see his bones through the skin. It was heartbreaking. Only Buck's heart was unbreakable. The man in the red sweater had proved that. As it was with Buck, so it was with his mates. They were also a bunch of skin and bones. There were 7, including him. In their pain, they no longer felt the sting of the whip or the pain of the club. They were not half living or even a quarter living. When a stop was made, they dropped down as if dead. Then came a day when Billy, the good-natured, fell and could not rise. Hal had traded his gun, so he took his big knife and hit Billy on the head as he lay in the snow. Then he cut the body free of the harness and dragged it to one side. Buck saw, and the other mates saw, and they knew that this thing was close to them. In the next few days another dog died, and only 5 of them were left. Joe, too wasted to be mean now. Pike, who suffered from 2 bad legs. Sol-leks, still faithful to the harness, but terribly sad that he had no strength left. Teek, who had not traveled as far as the original team, and Buck, half blind with weakness and hardly feeling the trail under his feet. It was beautiful spring weather, but neither man nor dog took notice of it. Each day the sun rose earlier and set later. It was dawn by 3 in the morning, and darkness came around 9 at night. The whole long day was bright with sunshine. The ghostly winter had given way to the life of spring, and an awakening had begun. Everything seemed washed with the joy of living. All things, from the trees to the animals, were obeying the cycle of nature. From every hill came the sound of running water and the music of unseen rivers. All things were becoming unfrozen. The Yukon was trying to break loose from the ice that held it. The sun ate the ice from above, while the river ate it from underneath. Holes of air were made, while whole pieces of ice fell into the river. And in the middle of all of the spring's activity and beauty rode the 2 men, the woman, and the huskies. With the dogs falling, Mercedes crying, Hal shouting, and Charles ready to quit, they rode into John Thornton's camp at the mouth of the White River. When they stopped the sled, the dogs fell down as if they had been struck dead. Mercedes dried her eyes and looked at John Thornton. Charles sat down in some wood to rest. Hal did all the talking. John, who continued to work on a piece of wood, gave short answers and little advice. It was not because he was unfriendly or unhelpful. He had met people like them before, and he knew that any advice he gave would be of no help. "We've heard that the top ice of the river is ready to fall through and that we should wait," said Hal after John warned him not to travel any more. "But they also told us we wouldn't make White River, and here we are." He said this last sentence with an air of great pride. "And they told you the truth," answered John. "The bottom of the ice is ready to drop at any moment. Only fools with the blind luck of fools could have made it. I tell you the truth when I say that no amount of gold would ever get me to travel on that ice right now." "That's because you're not a fool, I suppose," said Hal angrily. "All the same, we're going to Dawson." He picked up his whip. "Get up, Buck. Get going." John kept on working. It was of no use, he knew, to get between Hal and the dogs, as it was no use to get between a fool and his idea. But the team did not get up at Hal's command. It had long since passed into the stage where blows were required to rouse it. The whip flashed out here and there. On it is merciless errands. John Thornton pressed his lips tightly together. Sol-leks was the first to climb to his feet. Teek followed. Joe came next, crying with pain. Pike also made a painful try. Twice he fell over, but on the 3rd try he managed to stand. Buck made no effort. He lay quietly where he had fallen. The whip struck him again and again, but he neither cried nor struggled. Several times John started to say something, but then changed his mind. His eyes were wet, and he began to walk up and down as the whipping continued. This was the first time that Buck had failed, and it made Hal even angrier that he had failed in front of John Thornton. He exchanged the whip for the club. Buck refused to move even under a rain of blows. Like his mates, he could barely get up, but unlike his mates, he had made up his mind not to get up. He had a strange feeling that something terrible was soon to happen. This feeling was strong when they pulled into John's camp, and it had not left him. He knew that the thin ice was dangerous for travel, that something terrible lay ahead there where his master was trying to get him to go. He refused to move. So greatly had he suffered on this journey, and so far wasted was he, that the blows from the club did not hurt much. And as they continued to fall on him, the light of life in his body slowly became darker. Strangely, he began to feel nothing. He could barely hear the fall of the club on his body. But it was no longer his body. It seemed so far away. And then, suddenly, without warning, John Thornton jumped upon Hal. Hal fell back as if hit by a falling tree. Mercedes screamed, but Charles remained seated upon the pile of wood. John Thornton stood over Buck, struggling to control his anger. "If you hit that dog again, I'll kill you," he said to Hal. "It's my dog," Hal replied, wiping the blood from his mouth as he came back. "Get out of my way, or I'll fix you. I'm going to Dawson." Thornton stood between Hal and Buck, showing that he had not the least idea of getting out of the way. Hal took out his hunting knife. Mercedes screamed, cried, and laughed as though she was going crazy. Then Thornton hit Hal's hand with a piece of wood, knocking the knife to the ground. Hal tried to pick up the knife, but Thornton hit his hand again. Then he bent down, picked it up himself, and in 2 motions cut Buck from the harness. Hal had no fight left in him. Besides, his hands were full with his sister, or his arms, rather. Buck seemed nearly dead anyway, and could be of no use. A few minutes later they pulled out of the camp and onto the river. Pike was leading. Sol-leks was behind him, followed by Teek and Joe. They struggled in the harnesses. Mercedes was once again riding the sled. Hal drove the sled while Charles followed from behind. As Buck watched them, Thornton bent down and with rough, kind hands searched for broken bones. But he found none, only many bruises and a body suffering from starvation. The sled was 1/4 of a mile away. Dog and man watched it move slowly along the ice. Suddenly, they saw its back end, with Hal drop down into the river. Mercedes' scream came to their ears. They saw Charles turn around and make 1 step to run back, and then a whole piece of ice gave way. Dogs and humans had both disappeared. Only a big hole remained. John Thornton and Buck looked at each other. "You poor devil," said John, and Buck licked his hand. Chapter 6. For the Love of a Man. Last winter, the cold had injured John Thornton's feet. Because of this, he had stayed behind at the river, leaving his partners to make the journey up to Dawson. Thornton was still a little hurt at the time he rescued Buck, but the warm weather helped him improve. And here, lying by the side of the river, listening lazily to the songs of birds and nature, Buck slowly got back his strength. A rest comes very good after one has traveled 3,000 miles, and Buck became lazy as his wounds healed and his muscles became larger, covering his bones. They were all relaxing, Buck, John Thornton, and Skeet and Nig, waiting for the boat to come to carry them back to Dawson. Skeet was a female dog who made friends early with Buck, when he was too sick to refuse her company. She had the doctor trait which some dogs possess, and as a mother cat washes her kittens, so she washed and cleaned Buck's wounds. Regularly, each morning after Buck had finished breakfast, Skeet would do her self-chosen job. Soon, Buck began to look forward to Skeet's visits as much as he looked forward to Thornton's. Nig, who was equally friendly, was a huge black dog with eyes that laughed and a good nature. To Buck's surprise, these dogs did not feel any jealousy toward him. They seemed to share the kindness and largeness of John Thornton. As Buck grew stronger, they tried to include him in their games, which John Thornton often joined in. In this way, Buck began a new existence. Love, true love, that was full of joy, became his for the first time. This he had never experienced at Judge Miller's house down in the Southland. With the judge's sons, it had been a working partnership. With his grandsons, a sort of protector, and with the judge himself, a proud friendship. But love that was burning, that was mad with feeling, was given to him by John Thornton. This man had saved his life, but even more, this man was a perfect master. Often men took care of their dogs as a kind of duty, but Thornton cared for his dogs as if they were his own children. He couldn't help it. He never forgot a kindly greeting or a happy word, and he enjoyed sitting down and talking with them as much as they did. He had a way of taking Buck's head roughly between his hands and resting his own heads upon Buck's. He would shake him back and forth while calling him bad names that Buck knew were love names. Buck knew no greater happiness than this, and at each shake back and forth it seemed that his heart would be shaken out of his body from too much joy. And when Thornton would let go, Buck would jump back, his mouth laughing, his throat full of cheerful growls, and Thornton would say, "God, you can all but speak." Buck had a way of expressing his love that almost hurt. He would often take Thornton's hand in his mouth and close it so tightly that his teeth made marks, but he would never bite hard enough to cut his skin. And just as Buck knew that those bad names were love names, Thornton knew that this bite was really a kiss. Though Buck would go wild with happiness when John Thornton touched him or spoke to him, he did not always ask for this attention. Buck was happy to love Thornton from a distance. Unlike Skeet and Nig, he would lie hour by hour at Thornton's feet, looking up into his face, studying it, following each expression with the deepest interest. Or sometimes he would lie further away, to the side or behind him. And often, as the relationship between them was so strong, John Thornton would turn around, feeling Buck's eyes on him, and Thornton's heart would shine out of his eyes as Buck's heart shone out. For a long time after his rescue, Buck did not like Thornton to be out of his sight. From the moment he left his tent to when he entered it again, Buck would follow him. His past history of masters had made him fear that no master would stay. He was afraid that Thornton would pass out of his life as Perrault and Francois and the Scotsman had done. At such times he would awake in his sleep and stand by the entrance to the tent, listening to the sound of his master's breathing. But although he had great love for John Thornton, and he seemed to become more civilized, the call of the primitive, which the Northland gave to him, was still very much alive. Faithfulness and love, things that came from fire and house, became his. Yet he kept his wildness. He was a thing of the wild, come in from the wild to sit by John Thornton's fire, rather than a dog of the soft Southland marked by civilization. Because of his great love, he could not steal from this man. But from any other man, in any other camp, Buck would steal, and his cleverness meant he was never caught. His face and body were covered by teeth marks from many dogs, and he fought more strongly and bravely than others. Skeet and Nig were too good-natured to fight with Buck. Besides, they belonged to John Thornton. But a strange dog was a different matter, and Buck had no mercy. He had learned well before the law of club and tooth, and he never stopped attacking, even if his enemy was near death. He had been taught by Spitz, and from other fighting dogs, that there was no middle way. He must master or be mastered. To show mercy was a thing of weakness. Mercy did not exist in the wild, primitive life. It was misunderstood as fear, and such misunderstandings meant death. Kill or be killed, eat or be eaten, was the law, since the beginning of time, and he obeyed. He was older than the days he had seen or the breaths he had taken. He was a bridge from the past to the present. He sat by John Thornton's fire, white-toothed with long hair, but behind him were all types of dogs, half-wolves and wild wolves, pushing him forward, tasting the meat he ate, drinking the water he drank, smelling the wind, listening with him and telling him the sounds made by the animals in the wilderness. They controlled his moods, directed his actions, and when he lay down to sleep, they dreamed with him and became themselves the stuff of his dreams. So greatly did the bridge with the past call him that each day mankind and the call of mankind drew further and further away from him. Deep in the forest a call was sounding, and whenever he heard this call, mysterious and exciting, he felt a wish to turn his back upon the fire and the camp around it. He wanted to run into the forest and on, though he didn't know why or where. He didn't wonder why. He didn't wonder why the call sounded so important, why it was so deep in the forest. But often as he started for the forest, the love for John Thornton drew him back to the fire and camp. Thornton alone held him. The rest of mankind was nothing. Travelers might stop and pet him, but he was cold under their hands. And from someone too friendly, he would get up and walk away. When Thornton's partners, Hans and Pete, arrived on the long-expected boat, Buck refused to notice them till he learned that they were close to Thornton. After that, he accepted them, but accepted favors from them as though he favored them by accepting. They were of the same type of large man as Thornton, living close to the wild, and they understood Buck and his ways. They did not ask for the same friendliness and closeness as they did from Skeet and Nig. For Thornton, his love seemed to grow and grow. He alone among men could put a pack on Buck's back in the summer traveling. Nothing was too great for Buck to do when Thornton commanded. One day the men and dogs were sitting near the edge of a cliff that fell 300 feet down to a river. Suddenly, an idea came upon Thornton, and he called Hans and Pete over to watch. With his arm in a sweeping motion, Thornton commanded, "Jump, Buck!" The next instant, Thornton was struggling to keep a hold on Buck, while Hans and Pete dragged them both to safety. "That's plain strange," Pete said after it was over. Thornton shook his head. "No, it's wonderful, and it is terrible, too. Do you know, it sometimes makes me afraid. I wouldn't want to be the man who does harm to you if he was around," Pete said, nodding his head toward Buck. It was at Circle City, before the year was out, that Pete's fear came true. Black Burton, an evil man with a bad temper, had been arguing with a new person at the bar when Thornton stepped between them. Buck, as was his way, was lying in the corner watching his master's every action. Burton suddenly hit Thornton, and Thornton spun around, holding on to the bar for support. Those who were watching described hearing not a growl or a bark, but a roar, and they saw Buck's body rise up as he jumped straight for Burton's throat. The man saved his own life by putting up his arm for protection, but he fell to the floor with Buck on top of him. Buck let go of the man's arm and tried again for the throat. This time he was partly successful, and Burton's throat was partly torn open. Then the crowd was upon Buck, and he was driven off. When the doctor arrived and began to take care of Burton, Buck tried to rush upon him again, only to be beaten off again by many men with clubs. A meeting was called immediately at the bar. It was decided that the dog had enough reason to behave as such, and from that day on his name was heard in every camp in Alaska. Later on, in the fall of the year, he saved John Thornton's life again in quite a different manner. The three partners were traveling on a narrow boat through fast and rocky waters. At one point, Hans and Pete walked along the river bank, helping to guide the boat by rope. Thornton remained on the boat, moving it along with a long pole. Buck, on the bank, worried and nervous, never took his eyes off his master. At a particularly bad spot, Hans let go of the rope, and Thornton moved the boat into a fast stream. When Hans tried to tighten the rope again, the boat was moving too fast. The boat caught on a rock, and John Thornton fell into the water, heading for the most dangerous and worst part in which no swimmer could live. Buck had jumped into action in an instant. He jumped into the water ahead of Thornton to meet him. When he felt him grab hold of his tail, Buck headed for the bank, swimming with all his strength. But he couldn't swim fast enough, and they were being pulled downstream to where the rocks were sharp and the water dangerous. The strength of the water as it pulled them was frightening, and Thornton knew that reaching the bank was impossible. He was smashed into a rock with crushing force. He held onto its edge with both hands, releasing Buck, and above the sound of the water shouted, "Go, Buck, go!" Buck fought to stay with Thornton, but the force of the water was too great. He swept further downstream, and upon hearing Thornton's command, turned toward the bank. He swam powerfully and was dragged out of the water by Hans and Pete. Hans and Pete knew that a man could only hold on to a rock for a couple of minutes. They ran as fast as they could to a point far above where Thornton was. They attached a rope to Buck's neck and shoulders and set him into the water. He swam strongly, but not straight enough into the stream. He discovered his mistake too late as he sped by Thornton downstream again. Hans quickly pulled on the rope, and Buck was pulled underwater. He was dragged back to the bank, half drowned, and Hans and Pete threw themselves on him, hitting the water out of his chest so that he could breathe again. A cry from Thornton reminded them of the situation, and they knew he was near the end of his strength. His master's voice acted like a shock to Buck. He jumped to his feet and ran up to the same spot on the bank. Again, the rope was attached and he was set out, but this time he went straight into the stream. He had made a mistake once, but he wouldn't be guilty of it a second time. Buck held on till he was on a line straight above Thornton. Then he turned, and with the speed of a train, he headed down toward him. Thornton saw him coming, and as Buck hit him like a moving wall, he reached up and closed both of his arms around Buck's neck. Hans pulled on the rope again, and both John and Buck went underwater. Slowly, painfully, sometimes one on top of the other, they were dragged back to the safety of the bank. When Thornton awoke, he was being dragged across land. His first thought was to look for Buck. He saw Nig standing over Buck, ready to start howling, while Skeet was licking the wet face and closed eyes. Thornton moved over to Buck and started to check for broken bones. He found 3 in Buck's chest. "That settles it," he announced. "We camp here, right here." And camp they did, until Buck's bones started to heal and he was able to travel again. That winter at Dawson, Buck performed another great act, though this time it didn't involve his master's life. Still, It put Buck's name even higher in Alaskan fame. This act of Buck's was especially good to the three men. They were in need of new supplies and were able to make a long trip into the East, something they had desired for many years. It was brought about by a conversation at a bar called the El Dorado, in which men were bragging about their dogs. Buck, because of his record, was being tested, and John came to defend him. At the end of half an hour, one man stated that his dog could start a sled with 500 pounds and walk off with it. A second man bragged 600 for his dog, and a third 700. "Nonsense, nonsense," said John Thornton. "Buck can start 1,000 pounds. And start a sled that is frozen in the ice? And walk off with it for 100 yards? Demanded Mathewson, another driver. "Yes, and walk off with it for 100 yards, said John Thornton coolly. "Well," Mathewson said, slowly and thoughtfully, so that all could hear, "I've got $1,000 that says he can't, and there it is." So saying, he dropped a huge sack of gold dust onto the table. Nobody spoke. If Buck could not do it, Thornton would prove to be a liar. He could feel the warm blood rushing to his face. His tongue had tricked him. He did not know whether Buck could start 1,000 pounds. The amount of weight scared him. He had great faith in Buck's strength, and had often thought him able to start such a load, but never, as now, had he faced the possibility of it. The eyes of a dozen men looking at him, silent and waiting. Further, he did not have $1,000, nor had Pete or Hans. "I've got a sled standing outside now with 20 50-pound sacks of salt on it," Mathewson continued. "So don't let not having a sled stop you." Thornton did not reply. He did not know what to say. He looked from face to face in the way of a man who has lost the power of thought and is searching for an answer. He caught the eye of Jim O'Brien, an old friend, and it gave him the courage to do what he would never have dreamed of doing. "Can you lend me 1,000?" he asked almost in a whisper. "Sure," answered O'Brien, throwing another huge sack of gold beside Mathewson's. "Though I have little faith that Buck can do it." The customers in the El Dorado bar went into the street to see the test. The tables were empty, and many people started to make bets against the result of the test. Several hundred men wrapped in furs and gloves stood around the sled. Mathewson's sled, loaded with 1,000 pounds of salt, had been standing for a couple of hours, and in the deep cold, it was 60 below zero, it had frozen to the hard-packed snow. Men bet against Buck, 2-1, that Buck would not be able to even move the sled by an inch. An argument began about starting the sled. O'Brien insisted that Thornton had the right to knock the ice from the sled, leaving Buck to start the sled. Mathewson insisted that the bet was for Buck to start the sled out of the ice. A majority of men who had heard the bet at the bar were in favor of Mathewson's rule, and the odds went up against Buck 3-1. There was nobody betting in favor of Buck. Not one man believed that Buck could do it. Now Thornton, who had been pushed into the bet, looked at the sled and the hard snow. He started having doubts, especially as it would normally take 10 dogs to move such a sled. The more he thought, the more impossible it seemed. Mathewson was very sure that he would win. 3-1, he said loudly. "I'll put another $1,000 bet on top of that amount. What do you think of that, Thornton?" Thornton's doubt was strong in his face, but his fighting spirit had awakened. The fighting spirit is higher than odds, fails to recognize the impossible, and is deaf to everything except the fight. He called Hans and Pete to him. Their own sacks were little, and together all three could only manage $200. This was all the money they had, but they placed it next to Matthewson's. Buck, with his own harness, was put in front of the sled. He had caught some of the excitement around him, and he felt that in some way he must do a great job for John Thornton. The crowd started to talk about his wonderful appearance when he arrived. He was in perfect condition, without a bit of extra fat, at 150 pounds. His fur shone brightly. As he walked past the crowd, men touched his fur and felt his muscles. They were as hard as iron. Suddenly the odds against Buck went down to 2-1. "Good Lord, sir," said a man to Thornton, "I'll pay you 800 for him right now, before the test. 800 just as he stands." Thornton shook his head and stepped to Buck's side. "You can't stand next to him," Matthewson warned. "It must be fair play and plenty of room." The crowd fell silent. Only the voices of people making bets could be heard. Everybody agreed that Buck was an amazing animal, but 1,000 pounds of salt were too large. Thornton bent down to Buck's side. He took his head in his two hands and rested his cheek against Buck's. He did not playfully shake him or whisper soft names, but he whispered in his ear, "As you love me, Buck, as you love me," was what he whispered. Buck made a soft growl to show he was ready. The crowd was watching and holding their breaths. The test suddenly became mysterious. It seemed like Thornton was trying to do magic. As Thornton got to his feet, Buck took his hands in his mouth, pressing gently with his teeth. It was the answer, not in speech, but of love. John Thornton stepped far back. "Now, Buck," he said. Buck tightened against the rope and then let them go loose a couple of inches. It was the way he had learned. "Right!" Thornton's voice rang out, sharp in the silence. Buck swung to the right, ending the movement with a break that stopped his 150 pounds. The sled shook, and from underneath it came the sound of breaking ice. "Left!" Thornton commanded. Buck did the same action again, this time to the left. The sound of breaking ice became louder, and the sled moved several inches to the side. The sled was broken out of the ice. Men no longer realized they were holding their breath. "Now, go!" Thornton's command rang out like a gunshot. Buck threw himself forward, tightening the ropes. His whole body was gathered together, his muscles looking almost alive under his fur. His great chest was low to the ground, his head forward and down, while his feet were flying like mad, striking against the snow. The sled moved and shook, half started forward. One of Buck's feet slipped, and a man unknowingly cried out. Then the sled started to move forward, little by little, but it never came to a full stop again. Half an inch, 2 inches, the sled started gaining speed till it was moving steadily along. Men could not believe their eyes. Thornton was running behind, encouraging Buck with short, happy words. The distance of 100 yards had been measured off, and as Buck neared the firewood that had been used to mark the end, a cheer began to grow and grow. When he passed the firewood, the cheer turned into a roar. Every man was celebrating, even Matthewson. Hats and gloves were flying in the air. Men shook hands, it did not matter with whom, and congratulated each other on seeing such a show. But Thornton fell to his knees beside Buck. Head was against head, and he was shaking him back and forth. Those who hurried up heard him cursing Buck, and he cursed him long and lovingly. "Good Lord, sir," said the same man to Thornton, "I'll give you 1,000, no, even 1,200 for him, sir." Thornton rose to his feet. His eyes were wet. Tears were running down his cheeks. "Sir," he said, "no, sir. You can go to hell, sir. It's the best I can do for you, sir." Buck took Thornton's hand in his teeth. Thornton shook him back and forth. As though moved by a common thought, the crowd drew back to a respectful distance and did not interrupt. Chapter 7. The Hearing of the Call. When Buck made $1,600 in 5 minutes for John Thornton, he made it possible for his master to pay back some money that he had borrowed before. He also made it possible for Thornton and his partners to make a trip into the eastern part of the Northland. According to a story heard among gold miners, a lost mine was there. Only a few people ever made it back from this area. More than a few had died trying to reach it. This lost mine was covered in mystery. No one knew of the first man to find it. It seemed like the story had been there since the beginning of time. Men swore their lives to it, holding tightly to their pieces of gold that were unlike any quality of gold in the Northland. But no living man in John Thornton's time had come back with gold from this mine. The dead were dead. Such was the way when Thornton, Pete, and Hans, with Buck and half a dozen other dogs, faced into the east on an unknown trail to achieve where men and dogs as good as themselves had failed. They rode 70 miles up the Yukon, turned to the left into the Stewart River, passed the Mayo and the McQuestion, and kept on until the Stewart became a little stream, leading into the huge mountains that marked the backbone of the continent. John Thornton asked little of a man or nature. He was unafraid of the wild. With a handful of salt and a gun, he could go into the wilderness and do whatever he pleased, for as long as he pleased. Not being in a hurry like an Indian, he hunted for his dinner while traveling in the daytime. If he failed to find any food, like the Indian, he kept on traveling, safe in the knowledge that sooner or later he would come to it. So, on this great journey into the East, meat was the only food to be had. Guns, bullets, and mining tools made up most of the load on the sled. In this way, their time was extended into a limitless future. To Buck, it was complete happiness, this hunting, fishing, and wandering through strange places without a time limit. For weeks at a time they would travel every day, and for weeks at a time they would stop and camp. When they did this, the dogs would rest and play while the men would burn holes on the edge of frozen streams and rivers. Here they would wash countless pans of dirt, hoping to find a few pieces of gold that would lead them to the famous mine in the East. Sometimes they went hungry. Sometimes they ate more than they could ever imagine. All according to nature and the luck of their hunting. Summer arrived, and dogs and men packed on their backs, rode on boats across blue mountain lakes, and went up and down unknown rivers. The months came and went, and back and forth they moved through the unmapped area, where no men were, and yet where men had been if the lost mine was true. They traveled through summer snowstorms, cold under the midnight sun, dropped into summer valleys where the insects were everywhere, and in the shadows of the mountains picked wild fruit and flowers as sweet and beautiful as any that the Southland had. In the fall of the year they entered an area full of lakes that was sad and silent. There they found no signs of life, only the cold winds and beginnings of ice. And through another winter they wandered on the old trails of men that had gone before them. Once they came upon an old path that went clear through the forest, an ancient path, and it seemed that the lost mine was very near. But the path began nowhere and ended nowhere, and it remained a mystery, as the man who made it and the reason he made it remained a mystery. Another time they came upon the remains of an old hunting camp, and among the half-rotted blankets John Thornton found an old gun. He knew that it was a Hudson Bay Company gun of the days when the Northland was hardly explored, when such a gun was worth its weight in gold. And that was all. Nothing to tell them about the man who in earlier days had made the camp and left the gun among the blankets. Spring came and went once more, and at the end of their wanderings they found not the lost mine, but a place in a wide valley where the gold showed like yellow butter across the bottom of the river. They looked no further. Each day they worked, they earned thousands of dollars in dust and gold rocks, and they worked every day. They stored the gold in bags, 50 pounds to each bag, and it began to pile up like firewood outside the small house they had built. Like giants they worked, days coming and going like dreams as they built up their riches. There was nothing for the dogs to do except pull in the meat that John Thornton killed, and Buck spent long hours sitting in front of the fire, thinking and dreaming. The dream of the hairy man with short legs came to him more often, now that there was little work to be done. And often, looking into the fire, Buck wandered with him in that other world which he remembered. The main feeling in this other world seemed to be fear. When he watched the hairy man sleeping by the fire, head between his knees and hands held above, Buck saw that he slept restlessly, with many jumps and noises, at which time he would look fearfully into the darkness, and then put more wood on the fire. Who was this hairy man? When they walked by the beach, and the hairy man gathered food and ate it as he gathered, it was with eyes that looked everywhere for hidden danger, and with legs prepared to run like the wind at its first appearance. Through the forest they moved soundlessly, Buck near the man's feet, and they were alert and watchful, the pair of them, with eyes moving and noses shaking, for the man heard and smelled as well as Buck. The hairy man could jump into the trees and travel ahead as fast as on the ground. He would swing his arms from branch to branch, sometimes a dozen feet apart, letting go and catching. He never fell, never missed the next branch. In fact, he seemed as much at home among the trees as on the ground, and Buck had memories of nights spent beneath trees where the hairy man held tightly to a branch while he slept. Close-in feeling to the dream of the hairy man was the call that Buck heard that seemed to come from the depths of the forest. It filled him with a great unrest and strange wants. It caused him to feel a sweet gladness, and he was aware of wild longings and stirrings for something he did not know. Sometimes he chased after the call into the forest, looking for it as if it was a solid thing, growling softly. Or he would push his nose into the black dirt where the long grass grew and smell with joy the fat, earthy smells. Or he would lay low for hours as if trying to hide behind fallen trees, wide-eyed, with ears ready to listen to all that moved and made noise around him. It might be that, lying in this way, he hoped to surprise this call he could not understand. But he did not know why he did these many things. He was made to do them and did not reason about them at all. Strange feelings came upon him that he could not resist. He would be lying in camp, sleeping lazily in the heat of the day, when suddenly his head would lift and his ears stand up, listening, and he would jump to his feet and run away, on and on, hour after hour, through the forest and across open spaces of grass. He loved to run down dry rivers and to look at the bird life in the woods. For a day at a time he would lie under some bushes, watching fat northern birds move up and down, showing their feathers to each other. But especially he loved to run in the low light of the summer midnights, listening to the softened sounds of the forest, reading signs and sounds as a man might read a book, looking for that mysterious something that called, waking or sleeping, at all times for him to come. One night he all of a sudden jumped up from his sleep, looking wildly about with his nose smelling the air, his hair standing up along his back. From the forest came the call, or at least one note of the call, for the call had many notes, stronger than it ever had before. It was a long howl, the same and yet not the same as the howls made by a husky dog, and he knew it in the old familiar way as a sound heard before. He ran through the forest as quick as lightning and as silent as snow. As he came closer to the cry, he went more slowly, being careful in every movement, till he came to an open place among the trees. Looking out, he saw, sitting high on its legs, with nose pointed to the sky, a long, thin timber wolf. He had made no noise, but the wolf stopped its howling, trying to sense Buck's presence. Buck went into the open, moving low to the ground, body gathered tightly together, tail straight and high, feet falling with great care. Every movement showed both danger and friendliness. It was the mix of fear and peace that marks the meeting of wild animals that hunt. But the wolf ran away at the sight of Buck. He followed, with wild leaps, hoping to catch up, and Buck ran the wolf up the dry river into an area where fallen trees blocked the path. The wolf turned on its hind legs, just the way that other husky dogs did when backed into a corner, hair standing on end and teeth continuously snapping together as if ready to attack. But Buck did not attack. Instead, he circled him and moved toward him with friendly advances. The wolf was careful and afraid, for Buck was 3 times his size and weight, while his head barely reached Buck's shoulder. Looking for his chance, the wolf ran away, and the chase began again. Time and again he was cornered by Buck, and the scene was repeated, though the wolf was in poor condition. He would run until Buck's head was almost at his legs, when he would turn around and begin snapping his teeth again, only to run away again at the first opportunity. But in the end, Buck's efforts were rewarded, for the wolf, finding that Buck did not mean to harm him, finally sniffed noses with him. Then they became friendly, and played with each other in the half-nervous, half-shy way that wild beasts show their friendliness. After some time, the wolf started off again in a slow run that plainly showed he was going somewhere. He made it clear that he wanted Buck to come, and they ran side by side through the midnight light, straight up the river, into the hills where it began, and higher, heading straight for the mountains. On the opposite side of a great hill, they came into a flat country where great areas of forest continued on, and through these forests they ran steadily, hour after hour, the sun rising higher and the day growing warmer. Buck was wildly glad. He knew he was at last answering the call, running by the side of his wood brother toward the place where the call surely came. Old memories were coming upon him fast, and he was moving to them as surely as if they were realities, not shadows of the past. He had done this thing before, somewhere in that other dark-remembered world, and he was doing it now again, running freely in the open, the ground underneath and the wide sky above. They stopped by a stream to drink, and stopping, Buck remembered John Thornton. He sat down. The wolf started on toward the place from where the call surely came, and then returned to him, sniffing noses and making actions for Buck to follow him. But Buck turned around and slowly started back the way they came. For the better part of an hour the wild brother ran by his side, crying softly. Then he sat down and, with nose pointing to the sky, howled. It was a sad howl, and as Buck held to the path back to camp, he heard it grow softer and softer until it was lost in the distance. John Thornton was eating dinner when Buck ran into camp and jumped upon him full of love, knocking him over from his chair, licking his face and biting his hand. Thornton responded by shaking him back and forth and calling him names lovingly. For 2 days and nights, Buck never left camp, never let John Thornton out of his sight. He followed him about at his work, watched him while he ate, saw him into his blankets at night and out of them again in the morning. But after 2 days he began to hear the call of the forest again, and this time it sounded with more importance. He had to obey. Buck's restlessness came back to him, and he was haunted by memories of his wild brother, and of the smiling land beyond the hill where they ran side by side through forests. Once again he took to wandering among the woods. But the wild brother came no more, and though he listened day and night, the howl was never raised. He began to sleep out at night, staying away from camp for days at a time, and once he traveled over the hills and up the river until he reached that land of forests and streams. There he wandered around for a week, searching for fresh signs of his lost wild brother. He didn't find any. He killed his meat and traveled, traveling with the long, easy speed that animals in the wild have, one that never tires easily. He fished in the wide stream that emptied into the sea, and by this stream he killed a large black bear who was also fishing. The bear was a hard fight, and this fight raised the last remaining qualities of wildness that were still hidden in Buck. And 2 days later, when he returned to the spot where he had killed the bear, he found a dozen small dogs eating his kill. They ran quickly away as he surprised them, all except 2, whom he killed with the same skill he used on the bear. His longing for blood became stronger than ever. He was a killer, a thing that hunted other animals, living on the things that lived. He lived alone and without help, using his strength and power, surviving in a hard and unfriendly environment where only the strong survived. Because of this, he had a great pride in himself, which showed itself in his physical body. It was found in all his movements, seen in the muscles themselves, spoken plainly as words in the way he carried himself, and made his beautiful fur coat, if anything, more beautiful. Except for the brown fur on his mouth and above his eyes, and for the spot of white hair that ran down the middle of his chest, he might well have been mistaken for a gigantic wolf, larger than the largest of wolves. From his St. Bernard father he had inherited size and weight, but it was his German shepherd mother who had given shape to his size and weight. His nose was a long wolf nose, except that it was larger than the nose of any wolf, and his head, somewhat wider, was the wolf head on a huge scale. His cleverness was wolf cleverness, and it was wild. His intelligence shepherd intelligence, and St. Bernard. All this, plus an education gained in the wildest and hardest of schools, made him a horrible wild animal. He was as dangerous as those animals that lived in the wild, the ones that killed their food and lived on a straight meat diet. He was at the height of his life, in full flower, and it seemed that power spilled off him all along his body. When Thornton passed a caring hand along his back, it seemed that his hair snapped with hidden power and electricity. Every part, brain and body, was at the highest point, and between all these parts there was perfect balance and equality. To sights and sounds that required action, he responded with lightning speed. Quickly as a husky dog would jump to defend from attack or to attack, he could jump twice as quickly. He saw the movement or heard sound and responded in less time than another dog required. He saw, decided, and responded all at the same instant. His muscles, in which total power ran, snapped sharply into action as if they were made of steel springs. Life streamed through him in a splendid flood, glad and wildly, until it seemed that it would split him open and pour forth through the world in sheer joy. "Never was there such a dog," said John Thornton one day, as his partners watched Buck marching out of camp. "When he was made, he broke God's model for dogs," said Pete. "I think so myself," Hans agreed. They saw him marching out of camp, but they did not see the instant and terrible change which took place as soon as he was within the cover of the forest. Here, in secret, he no longer marched. At once he became a thing of the wild, moving along softly, like a cat, a passing shadow that appeared and disappeared among the other shadows. He knew how to take advantage of every cover, to crawl on his stomach like a snake, and to jump and strike like a snake. He could take a bird from its nest, kill a rabbit as it slept, and snap in mid-air at little squirrels who tried to run away a second too late. Fish in open lakes and rivers were not quick enough to escape him. He killed to eat, never because he was bored, and he liked to eat what he killed. So often there was a play in his actions. It was his delight to sneak upon squirrels, and when he all but had them, let them go, crying in fear to the treetops. As the fall of the year came on, the moose appeared in large numbers, moving slowly down to meet the winter in the lower and warmer valleys. Buck had already killed a half-grown baby moose that had wandered away too far from the safety of the others. But he wished for the fight of stronger and larger animals, and he came upon it one day as he neared the river. A band of about 20 moose had crossed over from beyond the hills of forests and streams, and top among them was a great male moose. He was in a bad temper, and standing over 6 feet tall from the ground was as great a fighter as Buck could ever wish for. Back and forth the moose tossed the horns on his head, which branched out to 14 points and measured almost 7 feet in width. His small eyes burned with a wild and bitter light, and the sight of Buck made him roar in warning and anger. From the moose's side, just behind his front leg, an Indian feathered arrow end stuck out. This explained his bad temper. Guided by the instinct of the hunting animals which came from the primitive world, Buck knew that the wounded were easy to kill. He started to cut the moose away from the rest of the band. It was no easy job. He would bark and dance about in front of the moose, just out of reach of the great horns and the terrible strong legs which could kick the life out of him in one movement. Unable to turn his back on danger, the moose would become angrier and angrier. At such moments he charged toward Buck, who would retreat, pulling the moose further away from the others. But whenever the moose became separated from the band, 2 or 3 younger males would arrive to defend him, allowing the wounded moose to rejoin the others. There is patience among animals in the wild. Stubborn, tireless, and never-ending as life itself, that holds motionless for hours the spider in its web, the tiger in the bushes. This patience belongs only to life when it hunts for its living food. It belonged to Buck as he kept behind the group of moose, slowing its march, bothering the younger moose, worrying the mothers with their half-grown babies, and driving the wounded moose crazy with anger. For half a day this continued. Buck made his presence even larger by attacking from all sides, surrounding the group in a circle of danger, cutting away the wounded moose before it could rejoin the others. Most importantly, he was wearing down the patience of the other moose, and theirs was the patience of the hunted, which is always shorter than the hunter's. As the day wore along and the sun dropped to its bed in the northwest, the darkness had come back and the fall nights were 6 hours long. The young moose became less willing to come to the aid of the wounded one. The soon approaching winter was hurrying them down into the safety of the valley, and it seemed that they could never shake off this tireless animal that held them back. Besides, it was not the life of the group or of the young babies that was in danger. The life of only one member was demanded, and in the end they were happy to pay the price. As twilight came on, the old moose stood with lowered head, watching his mates, the cows he had known, the babies he was a father to, the other moose he had mastered, as they moved on at a fast speed through the fading light. He could not follow, for before his nose was the long-toothed animal that would not let him go. The moose weighed more than half a ton, and he had lived a long, strong life, full of fight and struggle, and at the end he faced death at the teeth of an animal that did not reach beyond his great knees. From then on, day and night, Buck never left the moose, never gave it a moment's rest, never allowed it to stop and eat the leaves of trees or the new grass that grew. Nor did he allow the wounded moose opportunity to lessen his thirst in the cool streams they crossed. Often, as a last attempt, the moose would burst into a run. At such times, Buck did not stop him, but ran easily behind him, satisfied with the way the game was played, lying down when the moose stood still, and attacking him when he tried to eat or drink. The great head fell lower and lower under the weight of the great horns, and the moose's run became weaker and weaker. He took to standing for a long time with nose to the ground and ears dropping. Buck found more time in which to get water and to rest. At such moments, breathing with his red tongue hanging out, it appeared to Buck that a change was coming over the face of things. He could feel a new wind in the air. As the moose were coming into the land, other kinds of life were coming in. Forest and stream and air seemed filled with their presence. The news of it came in upon him, not by sight or sound or smell, but by some other softer sense. He heard nothing, saw nothing, but knew that the land was different. He knew that strange things were happening, and he decided to check on things after he had finished with his present business. At last, at the end of his 4th day, he pulled the great moose down. For 1 day and 1 night he stayed by his kill, eating and sleeping, turning away and then back again. Then, rested and strong, he turned his face toward camp and John Thornton. He broke into an easy run and went on hour after hour, never losing his direction, heading straight for home through strange country, with certain knowledge of where to go that man did not have. As he continued to travel, he became more and more aware of the new change in the land. There was life throughout it that was different from the life he had known during the summer. No longer was this information carried to him in a mysterious, quiet way. The birds sang of it, the animals talked about it, and the very wind whispered it to him. Several times he stopped and breathed in the fresh air in great breaths, reading a message in it that made him increase his speed toward home. A sense of danger and something gone wrong weighed upon him, and as he crossed the last river and dropped into the valley toward camp, he went ahead with great care. 3 miles away he came upon a fresh trail that sent the hair on his neck straight up. It led straight toward camp and John Thornton. Buck hurried on, quickly and quietly, every nerve alert to the many details which told a story, all but the end. His nose gave him a description of the passage of life on the trail he was traveling. He noticed that the forest was silent. The bird life had all flown away. The rabbits were hiding. He saw only one squirrel, which flattened itself against a gray branch as if trying to become part of the tree. As Buck continued with the presence of a moving shadow, his nose was suddenly jerked by a strong smell as if it had been grabbed. He followed the new scent into the bushes, and there he found Nig. He was lying on his side, dead where he had dragged himself, an arrow sticking out of both sides of his body. 100 yards farther on, Buck came upon one of the sled dogs that John Thornton had bought in Dawson. This dog was still weakly moving, rolling about as if trying to escape death, and Buck passed around him without stopping. From the camp came the distant sound of many voices, rising and falling as if singing. Moving low on his stomach to the edge of a clearing, he found Hans, lying on his face, covered with arrows. At the same instant Buck looked to where their house had been, and what he saw made all his muscles harden, sending a shock through his body. A wave of great anger came over him. He did not know that he growled, but he growled out loud with a terrible sound. For the last time in his life, he allowed his feeling to win over his cleverness and reason. And it was because of his great love for John Thornton that he lost his head. The Yukon Indians were dancing about the ruins of the camp when they heard a fearful roaring and saw rushing upon them an animal the like of which they had never seen. It was Buck, a live storm of anger and revenge, throwing himself upon them with the purpose to destroy. He sprang at the first man. It was the leader of the Yehots, ripping the throat wide open until a fountain of blood burst out. He did not pause to worry about the leader, but attacked in passing, with the next jump tearing wide the throat of a second man. There was no stopping him. He threw himself among them, tearing and ripping, destroying in constant and terrific motion. Their arrows were powerless against him. In fact, so fast were his movements, and so closely together were the Indians, that they shot one another with their arrows. And one young hunter, throwing a knife at Buck, accidentally threw it into the chest of another hunter with such power that the point broke through the skin of the back and stood out beyond. Then fear and panic took hold of the Yehots, and they ran in terror to the woods, shouting as they ran about an evil spirit. And truly was Buck a devil, chasing after them and dragging them down, one by one, as they raced through the trees. It was a sad day for the Yehots. They ran far and wide over the country, and it was not till a week later that the last of their survivors gathered together in a lower valley to count how many men they had lost. As for Buck, growing tired of the chase, he returned to the empty, ruined camp. He found Pete where he had been killed in his blankets. He had been surprised during his sleep. Thornton's fight was written all over the ground, and Buck smelled everything that happened, down to the edge of a deep-water pool. By the edge, head and front feet in the water, lay Skeet, faithful to the last. The pool itself, muddy and colored, hid what it contained, and it contained John Thornton. For Buck followed the smell into the water, and no smell led away from there. All day Buck sat by the pool crying, or sadly walked around the now empty camp. He knew that John Thornton was dead, and he understood death. He had seen it many times, and knew that it was the passing out and away from the lives of the living. But he had never felt the pain of empty space that he felt now. There was a great emptiness in him, a little like hunger, except it ached, and he knew that food could not fill it. At times, when he came across the dead bodies of the Yukon Indians that he had killed, he forgot the pain of it. And at such times he was aware of a great pride in himself, a pride greater than any he had yet experienced. He had killed man, the highest of animals, and he had killed according to the law of club and tooth. He sniffed their bodies with interest. They had died so easily. It was harder to kill a husky dog than man. They were no match at all, except that they had arrows and knives and clubs. From then on he would not be afraid of man, except when they carried in their hands their arrows, knives, and clubs. Night came on, and a full moon rose high over the trees into the sky. It lit up the land like a ghostly lamp, and with the coming of night, crying and sitting by the pool, Buck became aware of a new presence and movement in the forest. He knew that what he sensed was not the Yukon Indians. He stood up, listening and smelling the air. From far away came a soft, sharp howl, followed by many short, similar howls. As the moments passed, these howls became closer. Again, Buck knew them as things heard in that other world, forever held in his memory. He walked to the center of the open space and listened. It was the call, the many-noted call, sounding more attractive and forceful than ever before. And, as never before, he was ready to obey. John Thornton was dead. The last tie was broken. Man and the claims of men no longer held him. Hunting their living meat, as the Yehots were hunting it on the trail of the wandering moose, the wolf pack had crossed over from the land of forest and rivers and entered Buck's Valley. Into the clear space lit by the moonlight they came, pouring in like a silver flood. And in the center stood Buck, motionless as a statue, waiting for their coming. They were struck with wonder at the sight of him, so large and still he stood. They did not move for one moment. Then the bravest one leaped straight for him. Like lightning Buck struck, breaking the wolf's neck. Then he stood without movement as before, the wounded wolf rolling in pain beside him. 3 others tried to strike at Buck, one after the other, and one after the other they had to draw back, blood flowing from wounds on their throats and shoulders. This was enough to push the whole pack forward, crowding them together, blocked and confused by their readiness to pull down the new animal they saw before them. But Buck was not frightened by their numbers. His wonderful quickness and movement gave him a great advantage. Turning on his back legs and snapping and cutting with his teeth, he was everywhere at once. To the pack, it seemed as if he was a solid, unbroken line of many dogs, so quickly did he move. They could not break through this line. But he had to stop the pack from getting behind him. So he slowly moved backwards down past the pool until he had his back against a high dirt wall shaped like a corner. This dirt wall had been made during the man's camp, and here Buck stood, defending himself on 3 sides. And so well did he defend himself that at the end of half an hour the wolves had drawn back, disappointed and wounded. The tongues of all, because of heavy breathing, were rolling outside of their mouths, and their white teeth glowed cruelly in the white moonlight. Some were lying down with heads and ears pushed forward. Others stood on their feet, watching him, and still others were drinking water from the pool. One wolf, long and lean and gray, came forward in a friendly manner with great caution. Buck recognized the wild brother with whom he had run for a day and a night. He was whining softly, and as Buck whined in return, they touched noses. Then an old gray wolf, thin and with many scars of numerous battles, came forward. At first Buck's lips drew back from his teeth, but in the end he decided to sniff noses with him. Immediately the old wolf sat down, pointed his nose at the moon, and broke out the long wolf howl. The others sat down and howled. And now the call came to Buck in unmistakable notes. He too sat down and howled. This over, he came out of his corner, and the pack crowded around him, sniffing in a half-friendly, half-wild manner. The leaders of the pack lifted up the bark of the pack, and away they sprang into the woods. The wolves followed behind them, barking in rhythm, and Buck ran with them, side by side with the wild brother, barking as he ran. And here may well end the story of Buck. Not many years had passed before the Yehat Indians, who lived in that area, noticed a change in the appearance of the wolves. Some were seen with splashes of brown on head and nose, and with a line of white that ran down the center of the chest. But more amazing than this, the Yehats tell of a ghost dog that runs at the head of the pack. They are afraid of this ghost dog, for it has more cleverness than they do. It can steal food from their camps in the hardest of winters, take animals caught in their traps, kill their dogs, and hide from their best hunters. But the story also grows worse. Many hunters who fail to return to camp are found by their Indian brothers with throats ripped cruelly open and with wolf prints all around them, prints larger than the prints of other wolf feet. Each fall, when the Yehats follow the movements of the moose, there is a certain valley which they never enter, and many women suddenly become sad when the story begins around the night fire about how the evil spirit came to choose that valley for its resting place. In the summers there is one visitor, however, to that valley, of which the Yehats do not know. It is a great, beautiful wolf, like and yet unlike all the other wolves. He crosses alone from the smiling forest land and comes down into an open space among the trees. Here the river turns yellow, flowing out from old sacks and pieces of wood. Through the sacks long grass grows, and other forms of plants, hiding what is underneath from sight and the sun. Here he sits and thinks for a while. Then he points his nose to the stars and howls once, long and sadly, before he leaves again. But he is not always alone. When the long winter nights come on and the wolves follow their meat into the lower valleys, he may be seen running at the head of the pack, through the soft moonlight or the shining northern lights, leaping huge among his mates. His great throat is full as he sings a song of the younger world, which is the song of the pack.